Bhakti Yoga by Swami Vivekananda. Part 3. Bhakti Yoga is in public domain. Recording by Vineet. The need of a guru. Every soul is destined to be perfect, and every being in the end will attain the state of perfection. Whatever we are now is the result of our acts and thoughts in the past, and whatever we shall be in the future will be the result of what we think and do now. But this, the shaping of our own destinies, does not preclude us receiving help from outside. Nah, the vast majority of cases, such help is absolutely necessary. When it comes, the higher powers and possibilities of the soul are quickened, spiritual life is awakened, growth is animated, and man becomes holy and perfect in the end. This quickening impulse cannot be derived from books. The soul can only receive impulses from another soul and from nothing else. We may study books all our lives, we may become very intellectual, but in the end, we find that we have not developed at all spiritually. It is not true that a high order of intellectual development always goes hand in hand with a proportionate development of the spiritual side in men. And in studying books, we are sometimes deluded into thinking that thereby we are being spiritually helped. But if we analyze the effect of the study of books on ourselves, we shall find that at the utmost it is only our intellectual intellect that derives profit from such studies and not our inner spirit. This inadequacy of books to quicken spiritual growth is the reason why, although almost every one of us can speak most wonderfully on spiritual matters when it comes to action and the living of a truly spiritual life, we find ourselves so awfully deficient. To quicken the spirit, the impulse must come from another soul. The person from whom soul such impulse comes is called the guru, the teacher, and the person to whose soul the impulse is conveyed is called the shishya, the student. To convey such an impulse to any soul in the first place, the soul from which it proceeds must possess the power of transmitting it, as it were, to another, and in the second place, the soul to which it is transmitted must be fit to receive it. The seed must be a living seed, and the field must be ready plugged. And when both these conditions are fulfilled, a wonderful growth of genuine religion takes place. The true preacher of all of religion has to be of wonderful capabilities, and clever shall his hearer be. And when both of these are really wonderful and extraordinary, then will a splendid spiritual awakening result, and not otherwise. Such alone are the real teachers, and such alone are also the real students, the real aspirants. All others are only playing with spirituality. They have just a little curiosity awakened, just a little intellectual aspirations kindled in them, but are merely standing on the outward fringe of the horizon of religion. There is no doubt some value even in that, as it may, in course of time, result in the awakening of a real thirst for religion, and it is as mysterious law of nature that as soon as the field is ready, the seed must and does come. As soon as the soul earnestly desires to have religion, the transmitter of the religious force must and does appear to help that soul. When the power that attracts the light of religion in the receiving soul is full and strong, the power which answers to that attraction and sends in light does come as a matter of course. There are, however, certain great dangers in the way. There is, for instance, the danger to the receiving soul of its mistaking momentary emotions for real religious yearnings. We may study that in ourselves. Many a time in our lives, somebody dies whom we loved, we receive a blow. We feel that the world is slipping between our fingers, but we want something surer and higher, that we must become religious. In a few days, that wave of feeling has passed away, and we are left stranded just where we were before. We are all of us often mistaking such impulses for real thirst after religion. But as long as these momentary emotions are thus mistaken, that continuous real craving of the soul for religion will not come, and we shall not find the true transmitter of spirituality into our nature. So, whenever we are tempted to complain of our search after the truth and that we desire so much, proving vain, instead of so complaining, Our first duty ought to be to look into our own souls and find whether the craving in the heart is real. Then, in the vast majority of cases, it would be discovered that we were not fit for receiving the truth, that there was no real thirst for spirituality. There are still greater dangers in regard to this transmitter, the Guru. There are many who, though immersed in ignorance, yet in the pride of their hearts, fancy they know everything, and not only do not stop there, but offer to take others on their shoulders, and thus the blind leading the blind both fall into the ditch. Quoting from Katha Upanishad, fools dwelling in darkness, wise in their own conceit, and puffed up with vain knowledge, go round and round, staggering to and fro like blind men led by a blind. The world is full of these. Everyone wants to be a teacher. Every beggar wants to make a gift of $1 million. Just as these beggars are ridiculous, so are these teachers. Qualifications of the aspirant and the teacher. How are we to know a teacher then? The sun requires no torch to make him visible. We need not light a candle in order to see him. When the sun rises, we instinctively become aware of the fact. And when a teacher of men comes to help us, the soul will instinctively know that truth has already begun to shine upon it. Truth stands on its own evidence. It does not require any other testimony to prove it. It is self effulgent. It penetrates into the innermost corners of our nature, and in its presence, the whole universe stands up and says, "This is truth." The teachers whose wisdom and truth shine like the light of the sun are the very greatest the world has known, and they are worshipped as God by the major portion of mankind. But we may get help from comparatively lesser ones also. Only we ourselves do not possess intuition enough to judge properly of the man from whom we receive teaching and guidance. So there ought to be certain tests, certain conditions for the teacher to satisfy, as they are also for the taught. The conditions necessary for the taught are purity, a real thirst after knowledge, and perseverance. No impure soul can be really religious. Purity in thought, speech, and act is absolutely necessary for anyone to be a religious. As to the thirst after knowledge, it is an old law that we all get whatever we want. None of us can get anything other than what we fix our hearts upon. To pant for religion truly is a very difficult thing, not at all so easy as we generally imagine. Hearing religious talks or reading religious books is no proof yet of a real want felt in the heart. There must be a continuous struggle, constant fight, an unremitting grappling with our lower nature till the higher want is actually felt and the victory is achieved. It is not a question of 1 or 2 days, of years, or of lives. The struggle may have to go on for hundreds of lifetimes. The success sometimes may come immediately, but we must be ready to wait patiently even for what may look like an infinite length of time. The student who sets out with such a spirit of perseverance will surely find success and realization at last. In regard to the teacher, we must see that he knows the spirit of the scriptures. The world reads Bibles, Vedas, and Qurans, but they are all only words, syntax, etymology, philology, and the dry bones of religion. The teacher who deals too much in words and allows the mind to be carried away by the force of words loses the spirit. It is the knowledge of the spirit of the scriptures alone that constitutes the true religious teacher. The network of the words of the scriptures is like a huge forest in which the human mind often loses itself and finds no way out. The network of words is a big forest. It is the cause of a curious wandering of the mind. The various methods of joining words, the various methods of speaking in beautiful language, the various methods of explaining the diction of the scriptures are only for the disputation and enjoyment of the learned. They do not conduce to the development of spiritual perception. Those who employ such methods to impart religion to others are only desirous to show off their learning, so that the world may praise them as great scholars. You will find that no one of the great teachers of the world ever went into these various explanations of the text. There is with them no attempt at text torturing, no internal, no eternal playing upon the meaning of words and their roots. Yet they nobly taught, while others who have nothing to teach have taken up a word sometimes and written a 3 volume book on its origin, on the man who used it first, and on what that man has accustomed to eat, and how long he slept, and so on. Bhagwan Ramakrishna used to tell a story of some men who went into a mango orchard and busied themselves in counting the leaves, the twigs, the branches, examining their color, comparing their size, and noting down everything most carefully, and then got up a learned discussion on each of these topics, which were undoubtedly highly interesting to them. But one of them, more sensible than the others, did not care for all these things and instead thereof began to eat the mango fruit. And was he not wise? So leave this counting of leaves and twigs and note taking to others. This kind of work has its proper place, but not here in the spiritual domain. You never see a strong spiritual man among these leaf counters. Religion, the highest glory of man, does not require so much labor. If you want to be a bhakta, it is not at all necessary for you to know whether Krishna was born in Mathura or in Vraja, what he was doing, or just the exact date on which he pronounced the teaching of the Gita. You only require to feel the craving for the beautiful lessons of duty and love in the Gita. All the other particulars about it and its authors are for the enjoyment of the learned. Let them have what they desire. Say Shanti, Shanti to their learned controversies, and let us eat the mangoes. The second condition necessary in the teacher is sinlessness. The question is often asked, why should we look into the character and personality of a teacher? We have only to judge of what he says and take that up. It is not right. If a man wants to teach me something of dynamics, of chemistry, or any other physical science, he may be anything he likes because what the physical sciences require is merely an intellectual equipment. But in the spiritual science, it is impossible from the first to last that there can be any spiritual light in the soul that is impure. What religion can an impure man teach? The sine qua non of acquiring spiritual truth for oneself or for imparting it to others is the purity of heart and soul. A vision of God or a glimpse of the beyond never comes until the soul is pure. Hence, with the teacher of religion, we must see first what he is and then what he says. He must be perfectly pure, and then alone comes the value of his words, because he is only then the true transmitter. What can he transmit if he has not spiritual power in himself? There must be the worthy vibration of spirituality in the mind of the teacher, so that it may be sympathetically conveyed to the mind of the taught. The function of the teacher is indeed an affair of the transfers of something, and not one of mere stimulation of the existing intellectual or other faculties in the taught. Something real and appreciable as an influence comes from the teacher and goes to the taught. Therefore, the teacher must be pure. The third condition is in regard to the motive. The teacher must not teach with any ulterior selfish motive for money, name, or fame. His work must be simply out of love, out of pure love for mankind at large. The only medium through which spiritual force can be transmitted is love. Any selfish motive, such as the desire for gain or for name, will immediately destroy this conveying medium. God is love, and only he who has known God as love can be a teacher of godliness and God to men. When you see that in your teacher these conditions are all fulfilled, you are safe. If they are not, it is unsafe to allow yourself to be taught by him, for there is the great danger that if he cannot convey goodness to your heart, he may convey wickedness. This danger must by all means be guarded against. He who is learned in the scriptures, sinless, unpolluted by lust, and is the greatest knower of the Brahma, is the real teacher. From what has been said, it naturally flows that we cannot be taught to love, appreciate, and assimilate religion everywhere and by everybody. The books in the running brooks, sermons in the stones, and good in everything is all very true as a poetical figure, but nothing can impart to a man a single grain of truth unless he has the undeveloped germ of it in himself. To whom do the stones and brooks preach sermons? To the human soul, the lotus of whose inner holy shrine is already quick with life. And the light which causes the beautiful opening out of this lotus come always from the good and wise teacher. When the heart has thus been opened, it becomes fit to receive teaching from the stones or the brooks, the stars or the sun or the moon, or from anything which has its existence in our divine universe. But the unopened heart will see in them nothing but mere stones or mere brooks. A blind man may go to a museum, but he will not profit by it in any way. His eyes must be opened first, and then alone he will be able to learn what the things in the museum can teach. This eye opener of the aspirant after religion is the teacher. With the teacher, therefore, our relationship is the same as that between an ancestor and his descendant. Without faith, humility, submission, and veneration in our hearts toward our religious teachers, there cannot be any growth of religion in us. And it is a significant fact that where this kind of relation between the teacher and the taught prevails, there alone gigantic spiritual men are growing. While in those countries which have neglected to keep up this kind of relation, the religious teacher has become a mere lecturer, the teacher expecting his $5 and the person taught expecting his brain to be filled with the teacher's words, and each going his own way after this much has been done. Under such circumstances, spirituality becomes almost an unknown quantity. There is none to transmit it, and none to have it transmitted to. Religion with such people becomes business. They think they can obtain it with for their dollars. Would to God that religion could be obtained so easily, but unfortunately, it cannot be. Religion, which is the highest knowledge and the highest wisdom, cannot be bought, nor can it be acquired from books. You may thrust your head into all the corners of the world. You may explore the Himalayas, the Alps, the Caucasus. You may sound the bottom of the sea and pry into every nook of Tibet and the desert of Gobi. You will not find it anywhere until your heart is ready for receiving it and your teacher has come. And when that divinely appointed teacher comes, serve him with childlike confidence and simplicity. Freely open your heart to his influence and see in him God manifested. Those who come to seek truth with such a spirit of love and veneration, to them the Lord of truth reveals the most wonderful things regarding truth, goodness, and beauty. The mantra Om, word and wisdom. But we are now considering not this Mahapurushas, the great incarnations, but only the Siddha Gurus, teachers who have attained the goal. They, as a rule, have to convey the germs of spiritual wisdom to the disciple by means of words, mantras, to be meditated upon. What are these mantras? The whole of this universe has, according to Indian philosophy, both name and form, Nam, Roop, as its conditions of manifestation. In the human microcosm, there cannot be a single wave in the mind stuff, chittavritti, unconditioned by name and form. If it be true that nature is built throughout on the same plan, this kind of conditioning by name and form must also be the plan of the building of the whole of the cosmos. As one lump of clay being known, all things of clay are known. So the knowledge of the microcosm must lead to the knowledge of the macrocosm. Now, form is the outer crust of which the name or the idea is the inner essence or kernel. The body is the form, and the mind or the antakaran is the name. And sound symbols are universally associated with the name. In all beings having the power of speech. In the individual man, the thought waves rising in the limited chitta, mind stuff, must manifest themselves, first as words and then as the more concrete forms. In the universe, Brahma or Hiranyagarbha or the cosmic Mahat first manifested himself as name and then as form, that is, as the universe. All this express sensible universe is the form behind which stands the eternal inexpressible sphota, the manifester, or as logos or word. This eternal sphota, the essential eternal material of all idols or names, is the power through which the Lord creates the universe. Now, the Lord first becomes conditioned as the sphota and then evolves himself out as the yet more concrete sensible universe. This sphota has one word as its only possible symbol, and this is Om. And as by no possible means of analysis can we separate the word from the idea. This Om and the eternal Sphota are inseparable, and therefore it is out of this holiest of all holy words, the mother of all names and forms, the eternal Om, that the whole universe may be supposed to have been created. But this may be said that although thought and words are inseparable, yet as there may be various word symbols for the same thought, it is necessary that this particular word Om should be the word representative of the thought out of which the universe has become manifested. To this objection, we reply that this Om is the only possible symbol which covers the whole ground, and there is none other like it. The Sphota is the material of all words, yet it is not any definite word in its fully formed state. That is to say, if all the peculiarities which distinguish one word from another be removed, then what remains will be the Sphota. Therefore, the Sphota is called Nad Brahma, the sound Brahma. Now, as every word symbol intended to express this inexpressible sphota will so particularize it that it will no longer be the sphota. That symbol which particularizes it the least and at the same time most approximately expresses its nature will be the truest symbol thereof. And this is the Om, and the Om only, because these three, O, M, pronounced in combination as Om, may well be the generalized symbol of all possible sounds. The letter A is the least differentiated of all sounds. Therefore, Krishna says in the Gita, I am A among the letters. Again, all articulate sounds are produced in the space within the mouth, beginning with the root of the tongue and ending in the lips. The throat sound is and ma is the last lip sound, and the oo exactly represents the rolling forward of the impulse which begins at the root of the tongue till it ends in the lips. Properly pronounced, this om will represent the whole phenomena of sound production. And no other word can do this. And this, therefore, is the fittest symbol of the spota, which is the real meaning of om. And as the symbol can never be separated from the thing significant, the Om and the Spota are one, and as the Spota, being the finer side of the manifested universe, is nearer to God, and is indeed the first manifestation of divine wisdom. This Om is truly symbolic of God. Again, just as the one only Brahma, the Akhanda Sachidanand, the undivided existence, knowledge, bliss, can be conceived by imperfect human souls only from particular standpoints and associated with particular qualities. So, this universe, his body, has also to be thought of along the line of the thinker's mind. This direction of the worshipper's mind is guided by its prevailing elements of tattvas. The result is that the same God will be seen in various manifestations as the possessor of various predominant qualities, and the same universe will appear as full of manifold forms, even as in the case of the least differentiated and the most universal symbol Om. Thought and sound symbol are seen to be inseparably associated with each other. Also, this law of their inseparable association applies to the many differentiated views of God and the universe. Each of them, therefore, must have a particular word symbol to express it. These word symbols evolved out of the deepest spiritual perception of sages, symbolize and express as nearly as possible the particular view of God and the universe they stand for. And as the Om represents the Akhand, the undifferentiated Brahma, the other represents the Khand, or the differentiated views of the same being. And they are all helpful to divine meditation and the acquisition of true knowledge. Thanks for listening me. Here ends part 3 of the Bhakti Yoga by Swami Vivekanand.